is made possible by the financial support of AARP New Hampshire.
Our regularly scheduled program will not be seen, so that we may bring you the following special presentation. Tonight, a Commitment 2014 special, brought to you by WNUR in partnership with the New Hampshire Union Leader and the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, the Granite State Debates. This evening, the Republican 1st Congressional District candidates.
And good evening, everyone. I'm Josh McKelvin, and welcome to night one of our Granite State Debates. Election night, 1 week from tonight, and this week we are going to hear from the candidates in the Republican primaries. We do begin in the 1st Congressional District. As you just heard, this is a district that includes Manchester, the Seacoast, parts of the Lakes region, and up into the White Mountains. Democratic Congresswoman Carol Shea Porter is the incumbent. She currently holds this seat. But we do want to introduce you to the three candidates on stage this evening. Dan Innes is the former dean of the UNH Business School. He also owns a hotel in Portsmouth. And Mr. Innes, thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Indeed. And Frank Ginta, former congressman. He held this seat for one term from 2011 to 2013. He's also the former mayor of Manchester. Mr. Ginta, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Josh.
And our third candidate, Brendan Kelly, is a former selectman in the town of Seabrook. His resume includes time in the Army. He also worked as a ship repairman and a commercial fisherman. Mr. Kelly, thank you for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you very much. I want to welcome everybody out there to our debate, and I especially want to thank WMUR for including me this time.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Those are the three candidates. Let's talk about the format a little bit. Candidates will get 1 minute to respond to the questions tonight. 30-second rebuttals will be offered as needed. We're also going to have sort of a lightning round. Everybody loves that, where we limit the answers to 30 seconds, rather. I will have some questions. We're also going to hear from our Gene Mackin, who is live at the Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College with a voter viewing party. As a question or two will come from the audience there. And, of course, we do have our in-studio panel. That includes Josh Rogers from New Hampshire Public Radio, James Pindle from WMUR Political Scoop, and Dan Toohey from the Union Leader. So with all of that out of the way, let's go to Dan Toohey. And our first question going toward Mr. Ginta.
Thank you. Once again, the militant group ISIS is making headlines with the murder of an American hostage. This time it's Steve Sotloff, who went to high school here in New Hampshire. Sotloff was the other hostage seen in the video where James Foley was killed. As you all know, Foley grew up in Wolfboro. His parents still live in Rochester. Mr. Ginta, to what ends should the U.S. military be going after this group?
Well, my heart goes out to Stephen Sotloff's family as well as James Foley's family. They both have ties and connections to New Hampshire. The Foley family still resides in Rochester, and Stephen went to Kimball Union Academy here in New Hampshire. What happened today is not just a tragedy. It was a killing. This is the second beheading that ISIS has completed. The American people are angry, they're frustrated, and rightly so. The most important thing under our Constitution is not just to protect Americans, but to protect our homeland. We need to eliminate and eradicate ISIS. It needs to be done immediately. And we need to continue to work with not just Britain and other allies to ensure that we eradicate ISIS.
Should there be boots on the ground?
At this point, we have focused our attention on an air campaign. The air campaign needs to be stepped up by this president. This president needs to come to Congress for an act of war vote. And we need to work with our allies in the region and around the world to ensure that we eradicate ISIS.
Let's go to Mr. Innes with the same question. Mr. Innes, to what degree should the U.S. be going after this terrorist group?
Yeah, I think first condolences to the families involved. It's a terrible tragedy, and we never want to see this sort of thing. But I think it's important that the U.S. takes swift action. And I'm still appalled, and I was even, reminded strongly today that the president doesn't have a strategy. How can you not have a strategy when we're dealing with this sort of hatred of America and people who are bound and determined to get us and to get the rest of the world? My strategy would be to wipe ISIS off the face of the earth quickly and firmly and make sure they never come back. We can do it with our air power and the ground forces of Syria and Iraq. And we can get this done, and we must.
Mr. Kelly, same question for you.
Yeah, I think we're all on the same page with this. You just can't keep putting up with this. You have to make a move that actually gets their attention, because otherwise they're going to keep on coming. My feeling would be we should be over there and just destroy all the military equipment we see there. Just, if you have a military person in it, well, that's it. Clean it all out and let them know we're serious.
All right, Mr. Kelly, thank you very much. Let's go to James Spindle with the next question related to this topic for Mr. Innes.
All right, good evening, gentlemen. We'll stick with the same topic. Given that the United States is the largest military power in the world, we hear a lot of phrases here in that first responses. We've heard about an active war vote in Congress. We heard from you about wiping them off the face of the earth. We can't put up with this anymore. Doesn't the U.S. have an obligation to stop this group from spreading? And I really want you to focus on how.
We do have an obligation. I mean, we are the sole remaining superpower in the world, and we should behave as a leader and as a superpower. I think it's really important that we step up to the role that we play globally. I think there are a couple of things that need to happen. First, the president needs to figure out what his strategy is going to be, and he needs to do that, I believe, in consultation with some of the leadership in Congress, so we can figure out what needs to happen to get after this. As I said in my first statement, I think using our superior air power, our technology, our ability to spy on our we need to use that. And then I think we've got to go to the leadership of Syria and Iraq. If we have a common enemy, it makes us friends, and that's the situation that we're in. Syria does not want ISIS to succeed, nor does Iraq. So let's work with them, get their cover on the ground, where they can be our eyes and ears and get things done, and then we get in there with the air power and really drive this home. I think that's the way to do it. And ideally, if you can get a coalition of other countries involved, we should do that. But the president has to do something, and he needs a strategy.
And Mr. Ginta, the same question to you, but your response to Dan was interesting. He asked about boots on the ground. You went back to airstrikes. If this is such an immediate threat to United States national security, that we need to wipe them off the face of the earth, that we need a war vote, why aren't we going all resources? Why aren't we putting boots on the ground? I know we're war-weary in this country, but why aren't we doing that step?
Well, it's because the president stated last week he doesn't have a clear strategy for this problem. So that is the fundamental issue here, is our president doesn't have a plan and needs to lead and needs to present a plan to Congress. Secondly, Carol Shea Porter sits on the House Armed Services Committee. She has been silent over the last several months on this particular issue. She's on the Committee of Jurisdiction. We as Granite Staters ought to hear from her and ought to hear what she believes in why we haven't had a plan, why this president, even a year ago who had briefings, was not prepared for this. And now we have had the unfortunate death of 2 Americans. This does have to stop. We have to continue with the airstrikes. But you are going to need an act of war vote in Congress, so Congress has the legislative jurisdiction over this issue. But the reality is the president needs to lead. He needs to provide a plan, and he hasn't done that as of yet.
Mr. Kelly.
I personally, I'm always opposed to war. I think wars are terrible. But they're out of living on this planet and have had wars all the time that I know of. And my feeling is you do everything you can to avoid war. But once you decide you're going to go into war, you go in wholeheartedly and you win. That's it. There is no other option. You go in and win. Like I said, wipe them off the face of the earth. That's my feeling.
All right, Mr. Kelly, thanks very much. Let's go to Josh Rogers now with the next question from Mr. Ginta.
Mr. Ginta, in a debate this summer, you were asked about Mr. Innes' opposition to the Patriot Act and said, quote, "You either stand with the terrorists or you stand with freedom and protecting Americans." What did you mean by that?
Well, we clearly need a balance between safety and security in this country. Part of the obligation and responsibility under our Constitution is to protect America, to protect our homeland. What we need to ensure is that this president does not overstep the authority that has been approved in legislation. Nothing I ever voted for when I served in Congress gave this president or the NSA the authority to spy on Americans. Clearly, what we need to do in the future is to have more specific legislation so the president can take his own opinions as to what that legislation means, number one. Number two, you need more congressional oversight. And third, you're going to need a civil liberties board with subpoena power to ensure we live in an era where terrorists like ISIS are beheading Americans. We've got to go eradicate that threat. We've got to make sure that that threat does not present here on our homeland.
So, Mr. Innes, what sort of surveillance do you think should be allowed to protect America's national security?
Well, I think the surveillance of Americans should be just like, the protections that we have and the privacy we have in other parts of our lives. If the NSA showed up at your front door and said, you've got a filing cabinet over there in the corner in your office and I want to look through it, we would tell them no, and we'd tell them to go back and get a search warrant. Right now, we have warrantless searches violating the Fourth Amendment that are taking place on our cell phones and electronic devices. I think that's wrong. And Mr. Ginta noted that we have terrorists beheading people in Iraq and Syria. We know who the terrorists are. That's who we should be spying on. Let's go after them. There's no reason to come after me. I am not a terrorist, even though I've been called one. We've got to get after the real terrorists and use the NSA to do that. The Patriot Act, as originally imposed, kind of gives that freedom to the NSA right now. We've got to get back and change that.
Mr. Ginta, he just referred to comments that you made. Do you want to respond to that, where you insinuated that he stood with the terrorists?
Well, it's not true. It's not true. Look, the reality is we have a fundamental obligation to protect Americans. Today, we had another American beheaded. We are all frustrated and emotional as Americans about this. We've got to be strong. We've got to be clear and succinct about what our plan and what our objective is. We've got to eradicate ISIS. We all believe that. Most Americans believe that. And that's where my focus will continue to be.
Mr. Kelly, what sort of surveillance do you believe should be allowed in the interest of national security?
I don't think there should be any great limit on it, but it has to have a focus. It has to be just like if you want to go search somebody's house, you have to get a warrant. And my feeling is if you want to start doing overall surveillance on somebody, you should have to have a permission to go do that, and that you have probable cause. To me, it's always about probable cause. You just can't be looking after everybody in the country. That's enslaving everybody, and I'm totally against that. I think obviously you have to have intelligence, otherwise you're never going to be able to get these people, but you don't have to have intelligence on everybody in the country.
Take it a step further then. Right now there are millions of undocumented immigrants in this country right now. Given the current climate that we're living in, do you believe that those people should be deemed initially a threat to national security?
Well, yes, because some percentage of them could be. So you have to take that as a group. I mean, that's somebody who who just walked in here and said, "Oh, here I am." I don't think we can allow that to go on. It's our fault that we allowed them to come through the border, and that's a big problem we have here. And we can't keep doing that either.
Mr. Innes, same question.
About the immigrants coming in? I mean, you really have to worry now with ISIS saying they're coming after us. What's the best border for them to cross? And we know where that is. And I think anyone who got here illegally is someone that we should be able to look into, whether it's the NSA or some other approach. Kind of tying it back to the last question, I like the point that Brendan made. I mean, there should be probable cause, and searching my cell phone doesn't give you that. But someone who came across the border illegally, I don't think any of us would have a problem with monitoring their activity until we can deport them or in some other way handle them appropriately.
Mr. Ginta, do you think there should be probable cause in examining an illegal immigrant?
Well, look, there is a process in place in this country. If you are caught here illegally, there's a process by which you need to go through prior to deportation. We've got to enforce the existing laws in this country, which is not being done by this president, nor is it being supported by Carol Shea Porter. Secondly, we've got to close the border immediately. This is a significant problem. If you look at just the illegal immigrants who have come across the border in the last year, it's because the president issued a DACA order 2 years ago, which he then reaffirmed several months ago. We've had more than 300,000 people come across this border. The border has to be closed. It needs to be part of not just national security, but homeland security. If we could at least agree on that, we can stop part of the problem and close a border where you could have potential threats.
All right, let's go to James for the next question.
Mr. Ginta, you've been on the ballot more than a half dozen times in the past decade. You've run for Congress, you've run for mayor and won, and you run for alderman, you've run for state representative. When Mr. Innes's allies call you a career politician, aren't they right?
Well, no, look, in the state of New Hampshire, I think most people expect that regardless of what your party affiliation is, that you somehow serve your community. That is a very strong tradition here in the state of New Hampshire. So I'm proud of the fact that I was a young state legislator and that I decided to serve as a city alderman. But I stepped up when the city needed leadership, and I decided to run for mayor when nobody thought I could win. And not only did we win, but we were able to provide the first tax cut in a decade. We were able to cut borrowing in half. We were able to bring crime under control and refocus the state's largest city. We were actually recognized as one of the best managed small to medium-sized cities in America when I served. I have been about service. I've also had 2 small businesses. I grew up in a small business environment with my folks still having their small business today. But my passion for the state and for this country is out of service.
Mr. Innes, I want to ask you just a quick 30-second follow-up on what I just asked him. You are a political newcomer, first time you've ever run for office. Why shouldn't political experience count?
I think it counts in some ways, but when you look at Washington, I mean, the problems in Washington have been getting increasingly worse over time. And the reason is that we're sending the same people down there over and over and over, and we expect different results. That's not going to happen. We need people with a different background, a different approach to problem solving, and with ideas that we can bring to the fore. And I think when you've spent your entire career in politics and you're aspiring to the next level, that you're really going to go down there with new ideas.
Mr. Innes, I want to stick with you with a different question. One question that a lot of folks in the Republican base are asking you. You have voted recently in Democratic primaries, including the last one 2 years ago, and the 2008 Democratic presidential primary. So I got to ask, did you vote for Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton?
Look, I mean, this question keeps coming up, and the facts are, and I'm sure you've looked back, I registered as a Republican at age 18. I'm a free market conservative. I believe it, I've taught it, and I live it with the business that I have in Portsmouth. And I've stayed true to Republican values through my entire life. I started paying attention to politics in 1974 when President Nixon was, going through some difficult times. But I remember the price controls and that didn't feel right. And I couldn't understand why at my age, but throughout my career, I have followed politics closely. And I think the Republican Party has it right when it comes to fiscal issues, small government, low taxes, and less regulation. And those are the things that I support. If you've listened to me talk, if you've looked at the website, read the op-eds, it's very clear where I stand.
So that means Dennis Kucinich?
He is from Ohio, as am I, but yeah.
Not going to tell us what you voted for, I see.
No, voting is a private matter.
Mr. Ginta, he does raise an important point, though, on the campaign trail. His ability, he says, to work with Democrats. Who was the last Democrat you voted for?
Well, it's a great question. I've, look at the individual. And I make decisions. I have supported Republicans. I am a Republican. I believe that Republicans have the best opportunity to lead our city, our state, and our country. And I'll continue to vote for those Republicans that I feel are best in a best leadership position. But the reality is that Dan was a registered Democrat in 2013. He did support Jackie Silly for governor in the Democratic primary in 2012, who was the pro-income tax candidate. He did in 2008, his first opportunity to vote here in New Hampshire, vote in the Democratic presidential primary, either for President Obama or Hillary Clinton. I think that's important information for Republican primary voters who are choosing their nominee for them to be aware of.
Mr. Innes, you want 30 seconds to rebut?
Well, I think there's a lot of presumption in that answer from Frank. Trying to discern who I voted for and what I've done. I would say, like many voters in New Hampshire, I've supported different candidates. And, it's something that I take very seriously. I think about. In the general election, I've almost always supported a Republican candidate. I agree. We're the best answer. We're the future.
Look, I think Republicans are the right answer in terms of how we're going to run our state, our city, our country. But the reality is Dan did pull a Democratic primary ballot, did vote for either President Obama or Hillary Clinton. He did support, and he publicly stated so, that he supported Jackie Silly for governor. I mean, she was a pro-income tax candidate for governor in the Democratic primary in 2012, and he was a registered Democrat in 2013. Governor in the Democratic primary in 2012, and he was a registered Democrat in 2013.
You're shifting in your shoes over there. I'll give you a quick moment to respond.
Well, you know, we're hearing a lot of statements here that aren't true. And I think if people look back over America, I mean, you know, the voting record and who I voted for and who I supported, I did not publicly support Jackie Silly, for example. But it's not all that relevant. What's relevant is that I'm a guy who will solve problems. I understand business. I have been in business. I've created jobs. I am a Republican, period. And, you know, this is, it's all, yeah.
Okay. We
He's
do have
publicly stated that he supported Jackie Silly. He wrote Jackie Silly a check for $500 in her primary. That was common knowledge last year, and it was common knowledge that he was a registered Democrat.
Okay, we got to Mr. Kelly. James got that.
Yeah, we've heard a lot about Democrats and Republicans. Let's talk about you, Mr. Kelly. 2 years ago, you were the Libertarian candidate for this office. Why are you a Republican now?
Well, I ran as a Libertarian because my friends in the Libertarian Party asked me to run. And so they thought with being an elected selectman I would do well. And, you know, 14,500 people out there voted for me. But I knew that as a Libertarian I wasn't going to get elected. So I got the insight this time that maybe I should take it serious. So I'm following Ron Paul's direction that he said you have to do it within the Republican Party. And so that's the route that I plan to take to see if we can get the Republican Party on the right track.
All right, right now we're going to take a little break and go over to Gene Mackin. We're not taking a break, so stay where you are. But we're going to go to Gene Mackin, who's over at the Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College. Gene, what do you have over there?
Well, Josh, we have a dedicated audience of voters here at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. Clara Monier joins us from Goffstown now. And Claire, what question do you have for the candidates tonight?
Well, I would like to find out what their solutions are for the crisis that will be occurring in the Social Security system in the near future. It won't be running out of money, but if a few changes were made at the present time, it would last a long time into the future for our children and our grandchildren. And I'd like to know what the candidate's position is on that issue.
Mr. Innes, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, Social Security is a major issue, and I think Ms. Monier is right in stating that if we make some changes now, we can avoid major problems later, and that's important. And this really ties into my plan for the budget deficit and debt. We need a strategic plan for the budget. We need a 10-year plan that lays out what we need to do to keep this country solvent as we go forward. Social Security is a part of that plan, that conversation. I think we need to be very thoughtful, and instead of thinking about the next election, we need to start thinking about the next generation.
Mr. Kelly, why don't you take it from there?
We have to do something. Keep kicking the can down the road is not a solution to anything. We have to elect people who are going to stand up and understand what they're supposed to be doing down there in Washington. I mean, we have $127 trillion missing, that, you know, unaccountable for pension promises that the government has made, that there's no way to be able to do that. At some point, it's all going to collapse unless we do something now to say, hey, let's get this thing, put it together, tell the people the truth, and, you know, let them cope and come to terms with this problem.
Specifically, Mr. Ginta, how do we maintain the solvency?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Clara, for the question. It's an important one. We have 54 million people in our country who receive Social Security benefits and want to make sure that it is there in the long term. The reality is, if nothing is done in 2033, the Social Security will go bankrupt. We do not want that to happen. We want to preserve and protect Social Security. It's going to take a bipartisan approach. We have tried, when I was in Congress, to take a bipartisan approach to deal with Medicare. I would take the similar approach. Let's sit down with Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, look at what the different issues are on both sides, and try to come to a reasonable solution. But the first thing you need to do is ensure that current and future recipients do not change their benefit requirement. That should not happen. We have seniors who are earning Social Security today who have paid into the system who should not have their benefits changed. So anything that we do should be on the outside, years down the road. Can do that, preserve and protect Social Security, and strengthen Social Security at the same time.
All right, let's have the same question. Let's shift it over toward Medicare.